Horns 24/7 says it's college football playoffs or bust for the 2024 Texas Longhorns, and I agree with that sentiment.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Remember, terms do apply. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, why it is college football playoffs are bust for the Texas Longhorns in their first season in the SEC. In the second segment, 5 things Quinn Ewers can do to win the Heisman this season, or 5 things he needs to do that he can control for the most part to win the Heisman this season. And then in the last segment, Texas has won their 3rd Directors' Cup in the last 4 seasons, getting out of the Big 12 in style. We discuss how they got to their 3rd Directors' Cup victory in the last 4 seasons. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Horns 24/7 put out an article saying that this season, 2024, first year in the SEC for the Texas Longhorns, would be college football playoffs or bust, right? And I think when we contextualize bust, we say if Texas does not make the college football playoffs this season, it would be a failure, right? I'm not sure if them not making the playoffs has too much of an impact on 2025 moving forward, because you could always bounce back in 2025. You're still going to have a hell of a roster next year, even if you lose some players or possibly lose out on some recruits, considering a down year. You also have to look at what would be a down year, right? Because you could still not make the playoffs and have 2 or 3 losses depending on how the board shakes out. So I think it would be a very disappointing season. I would classify it a failure if Texas doesn't make the college football playoffs this year. But bust, I think, would be limited to this season, because I still think that even if Texas didn't make the playoffs this year, they'd be fine. I don't think they would lose all the momentum Steve Sarkisian has built over the last 3 seasons. But I do want to take it back over the last 3 seasons, right? And imagine in 2021, after that Arkansas loss, right? Or in the midst of, 6 straight losses, right? One of the worst seasons we had ever seen at the 40 acres. If somebody told you that just in 3 calendar years, in your first year in the SEC, it would be college football playoffs or bust, right? Regardless of the switch from 4 teams to 12 teams, because that has a lot to do with it, right? You just have, 8 more chances to make the playoffs. So obviously a program like Texas should be in the mix if 12 teams are making it, but that wouldn't have been a reality in 2021. So just in 3 short years, we've gone from the laughingstock of college football to basically, if we don't make the college football playoffs, 12 teams or not, it is a failure. And I agree, right? And so when we look at it, why Texas should make the college football playoffs this year or bust in 2024, I think the first reason is you have to prove that the Texas Longhorns are ready to be an elite program again, regardless of conference, right? There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of chatter. There's a lot of narrative surrounding what Texas was able to accomplish last year, right? Obviously, Texas in their last year in the Big 12 finally got their act together, only had the 1 Big 12 loss to Oklahoma. Outside of that, ran the table and won the conference championship and made the college football playoffs, right? But a lot of people, even though I feel like most of them are kicking the can down the road, right? A lot of people feel as though that Texas only enjoyed that success last year because they were in the Big 12, right? And Texas is in for, in air quotes, a rude awakening, right? When they get into the SEC and have to deal with the best teams in the country every week, and the physicality every week, and the grind of going to schools like Arkansas and Texas A&M and Florida and Kentucky and Vanderbilt, et cetera, right? So whether it's fair or not that it's working against Texas in a sense, Texas has to go out and prove that that is not true, right? Texas has to go out and prove that the University of Texas is one of the best programs in college football again, regardless of them being in the Big 12 or the SEC, because that narrative starts to work against you if you go out this year and falter, right? Even if you backtrack and go 8-5, the easy narrative that's out there is, oh, okay, so Texas had 1 good year in the Big 12 and then immediately fell right back down to earth when they got into the SEC. And whether it's fair or not, perception is reality, right? And so if Texas first year in the SEC, they struggle, there's going to be people that think, once again, fair or not, that Texas struggled because of the jump up in competition, right? Or they're going to use that 1 year as the sample size, because that'll be the only sample size they have. And they'll say, I knew, right, that Texas wouldn't fare well or wouldn't be able to compete in the SEC, right? And you could say that that's just noise. You could say that that's just narratives, right? But now, because of social media, just the media period, right, the noise is louder than ever. So what if a player that was considering Texas in the transfer portal looks at it and says, I may want to go to another school in the SEC that I think is better equipped to compete right now, right? Or what about recruits in high school who are saying, damn, I was looking at Texas, but they got to the SEC and lost 5 games, right? I don't think they're ready for the SEC. I'm going to go look at Georgia, Alabama, et cetera, or maybe, Ohio State, Michigan in the Big Ten, whatever, right? To me, I think Texas needs to prove to the world that last year didn't happen because they were in the Big 12. Last year happened because Texas is either back or on the verge of being back, depending on what your definition is. And if they have a strong season in the SEC this year, one, it'll shut up all the doubters. It'll shut up all the narratives. It'll shut up a lot of the noise. But more importantly than that, you're proving to the people that matter, recruits, right, whether they're in the transfer portal or in high school, that this is not a fluke. This is not a flash in the pan. This is who Texas will be moving forward. And if you can prove to recruits that you can do this in the SEC, then that's going to benefit your recruiting for the next decade plus. The second reason is there aren't 12 teams in college football with the depth of talent that the Texas football team has. So it would just be a categorical failure if Texas did not make the 12-team playoff, because there are not 12 teams in college football right now that have the roster that the University of Texas has. I mean, when you talk about a Heisman Trophy candidate at quarterback, right? You're talking about 5 stars at running back, the talent they have at tight end, right? 5 stars at wide receiver. Kelvin Banks, left tackle, right? Borderline 4 or 5-star, but he's going to be a top 10, 15 pick in the NFL draft. Devon Campbell, 5-star. You got 5 stars coming off the bench on the offensive line. And then we talked about, on the defense as well, 5 stars at every position, blue chip players pretty much starting at every position. There aren't 12 teams in college football right now that can say they have the roster or resources that the University of Texas has, right? And so now that there is a 12-team playoff, Texas should be in it every year, right? Every year that Texas is not in the 12-team playoff, it would be a failure, even in the first year of the 12-team playoff, even in their first year in the SEC. Anytime that the University of Texas cannot validate themselves as the 12 best teams in the country, and that's how you would do it, right? Being in the college football playoffs. Anytime that Texas cannot validate themselves as being one of the 12 best teams in the country moving forward, especially after what we saw last year, that would be a failure for this program. Although Texas is stacked in talent, following this season, they could be losing double-digit players to the draft again, right? They just had 11 players drafted last year, including, once again, a Heisman Trophy winner / first-round quarterback, right? Whatever, metrics Quinn Ewers reaches this year, a first-round left tackle. Trey Moore, who's had 22.5 sacks the last couple of seasons. He could leave after this year. Isaiah Bond, right? One of the best wide receivers in the country. He could certainly be a first-round pick along with Trey Moore, right? If they have the type of season that they had, the last couple of years, they could be first-round picks. They could lead this team. Jaden Blue, et cetera, et cetera. Alfred Collins, the list goes on, right? And so you're looking at a Texas football team that could lose, once again, 10-plus players to the NFL draft, right? And you can't just assume losing that many players to the NFL draft that you're going to just continue to bounce back and be the same team over and over again, right? We saw Georgia. They lost Stetson Bennett, and even though they only lost 1 game this year, right, it was the most important game for them, essentially, the SEC championship, but they weren't the same team, right? Even though Carson Beck was good this season, right, they weren't the same team that they were with Stetson Bennett, right? Same thing with Alabama, right? Even though they won the SEC championship and were a play or 2 away from the national championship game, to me, they weren't the same team that they were with Bryce Young, right? Even though they still were one of the best teams in the country, right? So, I think in terms of the quarterback position, I think we'll be fine, right, with Arch Manning. But when you go a 2-year span, right, losing over 20 players to the NFL, right, then you can't just assume that in 2025 you'll just reload, right? Because you're losing some of the best players in the country. And at the end of the day, you have to make sure that while you have these players in a Texas jersey, while you have these players on campus, you maximize them, right? Because Bijan Robinson got way more out of the University of Texas than the University of Texas got out of Bijan Robinson, right? While you have players like Quinn Ewers on campus, while you have players like Kelvin Banks on campus, Isaiah Bond, Trey Moore, Jaden Blue, Alfred Collins, et cetera, right? Andrew Makuba, the list goes on. You need to maximize them and make sure you accomplish what you can at the highest level when you have these type of players on campus. Because like I said, when you're losing another 10, 11 players to the NFL draft, which I expect this year again, you can't just assume that the players on the bench or the players that you have behind them will automatically step in and give you the same production that you're used to seeing from these players. So once again, stacked roster this year. You can never take having this much talent for granted, right? Even if you expect Texas to be just as talented next season, you can never take having this much talent for granted. Look at Florida State, right? They're in the college football playoffs if Jordan Travis doesn't get hurt. We never know if they'll have another undefeated season again. We never know if they'll ever get back to that point again, right? Sometimes you have to make it happen while you have it, right? Because you don't know what next year is going to look like. And even though I think Texas will be just fine in 2025, we don't know that for a fact. So they have to take advantage of what they have in 2024. And the last thing is they must take advantage of a favorable schedule when given the opportunity. When you look at Florida this year, I think they have a 5-game stretch where they play Ole Miss, LSU, Georgia, Texas, and Florida State, right? That is hell on earth, right? When you look at Texas' schedule, to me, there's only 2 games on the schedule this year where I would be fine if they lost, right? Fine in terms of like, okay, that's a really good team. That's a really good program. I'm okay with that. Obviously, emotionally, I wouldn't be fine. I'd be pissed off, right? But if they lost to Michigan, I would say, okay, they won the championship last year, even without Jim Harbaugh, even without J.J. McCarthy, some other players on that team. I still think that's a really respectable program, tough environment on the road, second week of the season. Like Michigan just got you, right? If you lose to Georgia, obviously, I don't think too many Texas fans are going to be punching holes in the wall, right? Georgia's a really good program, 2 national championships in the last 3 years, right? Anybody else on the schedule, if you were to lose that game, I would be disappointed. Now, obviously, anything can happen in a rivalry game on the road at Arkansas or on the road at Texas A&M, but I still think you should win those games. Anything could happen in Red River, but I think in Jackson Arnold's first Red River start, his less than 10th start overall, it'd be like his 7th or 8th. What Oklahoma has lost this offseason, just when I look at Texas roster compared to theirs, and you have the motivation factor of losing that game last season that almost cost you the college football playoffs to begin with, I think that would be a bad loss if Texas lost to that Oklahoma team, and then anybody else, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Florida, Mississippi State, UTSA, whoever else you want to throw in the mix, Colorado State. To me, those would all be bad losses, right? So Texas has a favorable schedule, right? I think they have a schedule where anything other than 10-2 or better would be a failure, right? Or would be very disappointing. And so when you have a schedule like this, when given the opportunity, you have to take advantage of it. Because like I said, you could have Florida's schedule where you're playing, 5 of the best teams in the country, arguably 5 top 10 teams in the country over a 5-game stretch, right? That'd be really tough. Texas does not have that. If anything, they have one of, if not the easiest schedule in the SEC this season. So with the 12-team playoff, even though it's your first year in the SEC, you must take advantage. A quick word from our sponsors, and then 5 things Quinn Ewers needs to do to secure a Heisman Trophy for himself in the University of Texas football team this season. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by Gametime, the best ticketing app alive. I always use Gametime for my football needs, my baseball needs. I just used Gametime this past weekend when I was in Vegas to go to the Las Vegas Aces and Seattle Storm game. Definitely been loving women's basketball over the past year. Been watching a lot of college and the WNBA. So I just went to, on last Friday, the Las Vegas Aces Seattle Storm game in Vegas. Only paid $34 all inclusive for those tickets, and I bought them on the Gametime app. Also, which you can get on the Gametime app. Like I said, I just gave you a reason why it's the best ticketing app in the industry, but this is one of the reasons as well. They have priority last minute deals. You save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. Flash deals, save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Zone deals, you save even more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose the seats. All in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Like I said, it told me it was $34. I paid $34. Seat views, get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And the lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. I just want to say how much of a blessing that was. That was a true story. I don't know if I need to say that. Like, I didn't just say that for the ad read. I really did go to a Aces game in Vegas last Friday for $34, which is insane, right? I mean, the Aces are back-to-back champions. So Friday night in Vegas for the back-to-back champions, you can see them in the 200 section for $34, right? Like, that's crazy. But I have a feeling those same tickets going to be $100 in a couple of years, right? With the Caitlin Clark effect and just the growth of women's basketball. So, yeah, Friday night in Vegas, Aces game, back-to-back champs, $34. Download Gametime right now. Locked On College, $20 off your first purchase. All right, Quinn Ewers is slated right now as a co-favorite to win the Heisman this season. I think he has the best opportunity to win the Heisman, right? You know, I think he's been kind of marketed as the superstar quarterback in college football this year. And, you know, it's a quarterback award at this point, you know, outside of Devontae Smith. So, you know, when you come into the season with the quarterback as the most momentum, I think that gives you kind of a leg up in terms of the Heisman. I think when you look at Shedeur Sanders, you know, he's probably billed right now as the number one quarterback in college football. He's probably the most likely to go the highest in the NFL draft. But, you know, I think when you look at the Heisman, that's a human being award, right? There's human beings voting for that, right? And to me, when I look at it, you know, I think that Shedeur Sanders and just that Colorado program period are very polarizing, right? There's people that love Shedeur Sanders and will go to war for him, right? But there's also people that are very turned off, right, by Deion Sanders and Shedeur Sanders. And I think that whether that's fair or not, that could affect some Heisman votes at the end of the season. So I do think, at least right now, it's a two-man race between Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers. And I think if you're asking who has the potential to have the better stats this season or who has the potential to be in the sexier offense or better offense this season, I think undoubtedly it's Quinn Ewers, right? What it comes down to is the team success, especially when these two teams are on each other's schedule and very well could match up again in the SEC championship game. It comes down to not only who has the best stats, even though I think that'll be Quinn Ewers regardless, but in the 1 to 2 opportunities where they match up together, that's more than likely where the Heisman is going to be decided. And on that day, will it be Carson Beck or Quinn Ewers who snatches each other's chain, right? So I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. But here are 5 things Quinn Ewers can do to secure a Heisman for himself in the University of Texas this season. The first thing is stay on the field. You know, we obviously know the story and kind of one of the biggest red flags around Quinn Ewers at this point, especially moving on to the National Football League next year, is the availability, right? When you're a quarterback and you've spent the last 3 seasons missing some type of games, whether it was his junior year in high school when he was a starter, his redshirt freshman year at Texas when he was a starter, got hurt in the Alabama game and then missed the next 3 games after that, or last season when you get hurt in the Houston game and then you miss the next 2 games after that, he has to prove that he can stay on the field, right? I don't see a scenario in which, you know, Quinn Ewers can miss 2 to 3 games and win the Heisman, right? Especially in the Heisman race, just in college football, period. Every game is monumental, right? And like I said, I just don't see a scenario in which Quinn Ewers can miss even 1 game, right? You know, depending on which game it is, right? But I don't think he can even miss 1 game and win the Heisman this year, let alone 2 or 3. So what we've seen the last 3 years, him not being able to play a complete season, that has to change this season if Quinn Ewers wants to be a legitimate Heisman candidate. The second thing is I think you have to beat Georgia at home or in the SEC championship game, right? With Georgia by far being the biggest team on your schedule and with Carson Beck, to me, right, being your biggest adversary to the Heisman, I don't think you can afford to lose that game, in which would be a great opportunity to have a huge Heisman moment, just like he had last year on the road against Alabama. And if you lose to Georgia, right, not only are you kind of removing that opportunity for yourself to give yourself a big Heisman moment, probably the biggest moment you would have of the season, but you're now giving that Heisman moment to Carson Beck, right? Because at the time that Texas plays Georgia, I'm assuming that Texas will have 1 loss either to Michigan, right, or be undefeated at that point, right? Those are the only acceptable scenarios to me. So Texas should still be a top 5 to top 10 team at that point, right? Unless Michigan just beats Texas and then falls off the face of the earth, right? But no other scenario right now is realistic to me, because I think we beat Mississippi State, you know, all the non-con teams, and I think we beat Oklahoma. So by the time we beat Georgia or play Georgia, worst case scenario, we're 6-1. We should still be a top 10 team. So then if Georgia comes to Texas and beats us in Austin, that would be a Heisman moment for Carson Beck, right? And if you lose the regular season game, right, and then you play them again in the SEC championship, and then you lose to them again, Quinn Ewers definitely is not winning the Heisman, because now you're 0-2 against Georgia, and that means Carson Beck is 2-0 against Texas, right? So I think to win the Heisman this season, Quinn Ewers and Texas has to beat Georgia at least once, right? They're only on the schedule once right now, possibly 2 times, maybe even 3 if it came down to it in the college football playoffs, but that wouldn't affect the Heisman. But Texas needs to beat Georgia this season, whether it be in the regular season or in a rematch in the conference championship game. I think Texas has to beat Texas A&M, right? When you look at it, if that's their only loss on the schedule, then I still think there's an opportunity for Quinn Ewers to win the Heisman, right? But if you lose to Michigan, you have plenty of time to make up for that loss. And obviously, Michigan just won the championship. That's a respectable program. If you lose to Georgia, nobody's going to say that's a bad loss, right? But you still have time to make up for it with performances after that, right? Even if you fall to, let's say, an Arkansas, Kentucky, or a Florida, those are really bad losses, but you have time to make up for it, right? If you lose to Texas A&M, that is the lasting taste in people's mouth, right? Essentially before they vote on the Heisman, because the next game after that would be the conference championship game. But I'm not sure Texas can afford a loss to Texas A&M and then still make the conference championship. The only way I could see Texas losing to A&M and then still being a lock for the championship is if they were 11-0 at that point and fell to Texas A&M. And how brutal would it be if Texas was 11-0 and then lost to Texas A&M in that scenario, right? But like I said, if they lose to Texas A&M, it's probably, I wouldn't say it's probably, right? But that's probably not going to be their first SEC loss of the season. And when I look at it, right, I think Georgia is going to end up with 1 SEC loss or fewer, right? I think Ole Miss is a very realistic chance, even though they have a tougher schedule, that they end up with 1 SEC loss or fewer, right? And then you still have schools like LSU, maybe Tennessee, Alabama that could sneak into that SEC championship conversation, and they could end up with 1 SEC loss or fewer, right? I wouldn't be just shocked if that happened, right? And so I don't think Texas has a ton of margin for error this year on their SEC schedule, and I definitely don't think you have enough margin for error to lose to a school like A&M, right? I just think narrative and perception-wise, that would be a huge crater to Quinn Ewers' Heisman chances. And I think that if you lose to A&M, that pretty much, right? Like I said, it would depend on what happened before that, right? Because Texas could go 11-0 and lose to A&M in that last game of the season. But it's a more likely scenario that losing to A&M would knock you out of the SEC championship game, period. And I don't think there's any scenario which Texas and Georgia are not in the SEC championship. So once again, that would be another feather in Carson Beck's cap that Quinn Ewers doesn't have, right? So I think you need to beat A&M, just perception, rivalry, the gravity around that game. You need to beat A&M for Quinn Ewers' Heisman chances. But like I said, I think if you lose that game, his Heisman chances are pretty much done anyway, because I don't see a scenario in which Texas could lose to A&M and still make the conference championship game unless they were perfect leading up into that point. I think he needs a Heisman-like performance at some point this season, 350-plus scrimmage yards and 4+ touchdowns, regardless of who it comes against. Obviously, it would mean more against A&M on the road against Arkansas, against Georgia, or against Michigan. But when you look at Jaden Daniels last year, his best games were against Ole Miss, which he lost, and against Florida, who wasn't a respectable program, right? So as long as Quinn Ewers just has that Gotti-type performance, I think he'll be just fine. But he does have to have one of those this season, right? 350-plus yards and 4+ touchdowns. He can't give you 250 to 260 passing yards every game with 2 touchdowns and expect to win the Heisman, right? He has to have one of those games where he looks like the best player in college football, at least one. And 350-plus yards and 4+ touchdowns will certainly do it. He's certainly capable of having that type of game. I don't know if he reached those metrics exactly, but it felt like he did last year against Alabama. But with this Texas offense, with Quinn Ewers' experience, with the weapons around him, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw 2 or 3 of these this season. I think Texas is on a completely different level this year when you talk about the offense. And then when you look at it, the last thing is you have to connect on the deep ball, right? It has to look sexy, right? We can look at the box score all day and say Quinn Ewers did this, right? We can throw screens all day and then, look at our yards after catch numbers and say, look at this, 75-yard pass from Quinn Ewers, even though, the receiver caught it behind the line of scrimmage and then ran 75 yards from the touchdown, right? At the end of the day, like, the numbers have to be gaudy, but the tape has to match the numbers as well to an extent, right? And we can't run the same offense we did last year and that lead Quinn Ewers to the Heisman, in my opinion, regardless of what the numbers look like, right? To me, he's going to have to look sexy at the quarterback position. Pause, right? But seriously, right? Like the deep passes, right? Spraying the ball all over the field, right? Dropping the ball in the bucket, those tight window throws, those elite passes that you expect NFL quarterbacks to make we're going to have to see that from Quinn Ewers, because to me, like I said, the stats aren't enough to win the Heisman this year. The box score isn't enough to win the Heisman this year. You're going to have to hit those deep passes, right? When they show that highlight reel on SportsCenter, when they're talking about your Heisman case, you have to look like an NFL quarterback. It can't be a bunch of RPOs and screens and hopefully Isaiah Bond takes it to the house. No, you have to spray that ball all over the field to win the Heisman. And so I think that, for the last 2 years, the deep ball has been very inconsistent. I think even if the numbers look great this year, right, you have to be able to spray the ball all over the field to convince voters that you were the best player in college football this season. To me, like I said, it goes beyond the box score, goes beyond the numbers. It has to look good, right? And the last couple of years, I think it's looked better, for the most part in the stat book than it has a lot on the field. Because like I said, a lot of the times it's been a lot of, short passes, RPO, dinks and dunks, and then relying on, run after the catch. We've been top 10 or we're top 10 in that metric last year, right? So that's kind of been our offense, dump it off short and then let your playmakers make plays. This year, I think we need to be bombs away to secure a Heisman case for Quinn Ewers. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we give flowers to the Texas athletic program as a whole and CDC for their third Director's Cup in the last 4 seasons. All right. So in the last year in the Big 12, Texas was able to lead the conference with style, right? And it's funny because, when people talk about Texas, they always want to talk about the football, right? And we get that because, football is what moves the needle. And for, I guess, probably 95% of Texas fans, right, football is the sport that they care about the most, right? But when you're a Texas fan or a Texas alum, right, you should take pride in the fact that even when football has been down, right, or even when football is not the creme de la creme, even though I think we're back at the top, we're not, the top yet, right? But even when Texas isn't the creme de la creme, you can still say pretty much every year that Texas arguably has the best athletic program in the country, athletic department in the country, right? And for 3 of the last 4 years, that's been tangibly true, right? Because Texas has won their third Director's Cup in the last 4 seasons. And what makes it special is your last year in the Big 12 to get out of there with another Director's Cup is special. Like I said, I know football moves the needle for all of us, but if you're a Texas fan or a Texas alum, you have to be able to take a step back and appreciate what all of the athletic programs, what the entire athletic department is doing and this Director's Cup. Because, I mean, maybe one of them, okay, right? Like, cool, we want the football team to be good. 3 out of the last 4, you have to appreciate what CDC has built at the University of Texas. When you look at just this year, the 2023-2024 athletic season, 19 of 20 qualified Texas athletic programs made the postseason. That's 95%. I think that's pretty good. Texas won 15 conference championships this season, most in Texas history, most of any Power 5 school this calendar year, 2023 to 2024 athletic year, I should say. Plus, Texas won 15 Big 12 championships during the 2023-2024 athletic year, right? And these are the schools that won those, right? Soccer, volleyball, football, women's indoor track and field, men's swimming and diving, women's basketball, the tournament, men's tennis, regular season and tournament, women's golf, softball, men's outdoor track and field, women's outdoor track and field, and rowing. And then soccer, it was tournament as well. So those are the 15 programs at the University of Texas that won conference championships this season. When you look at national championships, volleyball and rowing. So Texas had 2 programs that won the Natty this year. National runner-ups, women's swimming and diving, men's tennis, and softball. So Texas had 5 programs that competed for a championship this athletic year. Top 5 finishes: football, women's basketball, women's outdoor track and field. So Texas had 8 programs that finished in the top 5 of their respective sports. Top 10 finishes: men's cross country, men's swimming and diving, soccer, women's tennis. Texas had 12 programs that finished in the top 10 of their respective sport. Top 25 finishes: women's golf, men's basketball, men's golf, men's indoor track and field, men's outdoor track and field, women's indoor track and field. 18 out of 20 teams that made the top 25 following the season in their respective sport. And then you had the 19th team that made the playoffs. They just made the playoffs, was the baseball team, unfortunately. But when you look at that, I mean, those numbers I just, spit off to you: 2 won a Natty, 5 competed for a Natty, 8 finished in the top 5, 12 finished in the top 10, 16 or whatever it is, 18 finished in the top 25. Only one team not making the postseason at all out of 20 qualified programs is just ridiculous. And that's why Texas is winning their third Directors Cup in the last 4 seasons. And I mean, why would this not continue, right? CDC, what we're seeing with all of our programs. I mean, we have some of the best coaching, best recruiting, best resources, and best players in the country in all of these programs. Like I said, this should continue moving forward. Texas has been dominant, right, in the Big 12. I'm coming back to that. Texas has been dominant in the Big 12 and in the country, period, with their athletic program. All the credit in the world to CDC and all the credit in the world to everybody who makes all of this happen in these athletic programs, from the top all the way down to the athletic trainers, walk-ons, whoever, right? Hook 'em. Peace.